Hi, everyone. It is really good to be with you on this installment of our formation series, Rule of Life Living Life with Intention. So, I want to just take a moment and think together about where we've been. So, we've discussed why a rule of life can be helpful, that it can draw our attention to living into who God has created us to be. And we started that with considering listening, deeply attuning ourselves to the voice of God in our midst. And we moved from that to considering the section on being, where we considered things like gratitude and work, creativity and Sabbath, thinking through how our being might be aligned with the intentions that we discern when we're paying attention to the presence of God. We move from that to the section on vulnerability, considering suffering and fear and grief and uncertainty. All things that we really, I think, wish we could avoid in this life, but that our lived experience tells us is common to all people. It's something that we all share. And so having a rule that can coach you or remind you or bring your attention back to those things that heal you or help you to remain centered in God as you experience those seasons of vulnerability is really helpful. Being able to revisit those is really helpful. And today we're going to talk about body. So body is broken down. LaFond imagines both health and play, home, and then intimacy and touch and sex. So I think in many ways we're the heirs of our Greek philosophic forebears that had a very dualistic view of the world, where the spiritual and the soul was good and body and matter was bad. And that is an unfortunate legacy that we carry because our very faith is incarnational. Jesus Christ is the Word made flesh. And if the Word became flesh, the flesh cannot be inherently bad. So we have inherited this dualistic way of thinking about things where spiritual equals good and flesh equals bad, and that's not true. And we've also, we're products of the world that we live in, the environment that we live in. And the world that we live in seeks to make money by telling us what's wrong with us and that we should fix ourselves and that there's some ideal that with the right amount of money and potions we can become. And the truth is that you were wonderfully and fearfully made, created in the image of God. And there is no reason to spend any time chastising or belittling or fretting over your body. And LaFond actually talks about this. He says, let us consider our body and its need for a rule of life, one that encourages and gathers its boundaries, comforts its limitations, and yet not for a moment diminishes its joys and pleasures. And he goes on to say our body is a miracle, and he's absolutely right. So he encourages us to be tender with ourselves and to be kind and gentle with ourselves, and also to be real and honest with ourselves. So when we talk about the subheading of health, health is not meant to chastise. It's not meant to encourage you to think about, oh, I wish my body shape was different, or I wish that my energy level was different. Instead, when it comes to health, he invites us to consider what makes us feel better. What makes us feel whole? What heals us? He lists things like sleep and moderation and alcohol and work, avoiding some foods and maybe getting more of other kinds of foods, engaging in exercise and being outside in the sun. And I actually, for myself, sleep. For some reason, I want to stay up till 2 in the morning and get up at, 9 in the morning, and it is not a healthy habit. So some people can do that, and it's healthy for them. For me, it throws everything off. And so having a routine that I stick to is actually really important. It is not my natural inclination, but when I'm honest about what makes me feel better, and believe me, I do not like thinking about myself as a routine person. I do not want to be a routine-oriented person, but actually routine really helps. And having some limits around time where I can look up at the clock and say, oh, it's 10 and now I need to get ready for bed. It actually, having that consistency just makes me feel better. And so LaFond wants to draw our attention to those kinds of things where consistency and attention can actually help us to feel better. I know that for my husband, he can't do dairy. And it was a grief because he loved dairy. But as soon as he stopped eating it, he started feeling much better. And so the question is, do you love dairy more than you love yourself, your well-being? And the answer for him has become he wants to feel better. He wants to feel good. And what that means for him is avoiding that. So it's not always fun. There are times if we go out to dinner with family that I want to order dessert and the sad look on his face makes me feel really bad. But he's aware that the need to avoid dairy actually helps him to heal. It's a boundary, that observing that boundary is helpful for him. And I think that that's probably true for many of us. We probably know those things that make us feel good or make us feel not so great. And it can be difficult to observe boundaries around that. So LaFond is inviting us into intentional reflection and intentionally identifying those boundaries that are helpful and healthy and invite us to wellness and to fullness of life. I'll also say when it comes to exercise, I actually know someone who benefits more from exercise than from any antidepressant they've ever tried. And so recognizing that, being attuned to that is actually really helpful because it means that that person can subsequently say, actually, these medicines don't work for me, but I do need help with this. And what does work for me is exercise in the sunlight for 30 minutes a day. And so being aware and attuned and intentional with that can be very helpful. And remember, when you're writing your rule of life, you're expressing your hopes and what you feel called to be your very best self. And it does not mean that you will always live up to those hopes that you've expressed. Sometimes you will, and sometimes you won't. But expressing those hopes and turning your attention to those hopes when you read your rule of life is really helpful. So the hope, the intention, the routine is expressed in your rule of life, and you turn your attention to that once a month. You read your section on health and remind yourself of what you hope for your body. When it comes to play, LaFond draws our attention to creativity. He says it prompts ingenuity, it helps us process our feelings. And I thought, play, I don't know, I play, I don't know what that looks like for me, but his prompt, his question is, what delights you? So play can look like board games with friends. It can look like role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. It can look like um, play like when I take my dog out and we play with her toys. But what is it that you do to kind of blow off steam and just sort of let your mind go into a different place, or rather than being in the processing and working mode, where it can shift down into a different kind of mode, and where you can actually allow yourself to just enjoy doing something for the sake of doing it. So he says that if you've never had a list like that, to actually begin by writing down a list of those things that you just enjoy doing for the sake of doing them. He also has a section on home in this, and I thought it was rather lovely. He talks about his own home and how when he was looking for his house, he actually let his rule of life determine what kind of house he wanted to buy. That he did not want a large house. He didn't want a place just full of things. He actually only keeps things that he uses daily. And his house is quite secluded. So only people who, his friends and people who know that it's there, are able to access it. And a friend actually observed that it looked like a 2-room monastery to them. And I thought that was just kind of lovely, because that's exactly what he wanted. He wanted a place that was secluded, that friends could come and gather, but that it was a sanctuary. And so he invites us to think about what do we want in terms of our own home? And what are our hopes for our own home? What do we hope will happen in our home in terms of hospitality and welcoming people? And during this time of pandemic, I feel like that's taken on a different kind of importance, because our bodies are existing in our homes a lot. So one of the things that I've reflected on is how I wish that I had a room that was dedicated to my ability to work and study. And I don't. So there's no door that I can close to designate that I'm in a different space. So I have other physical markers. I light candles. I really love incense. When I'm preparing sermons, I will light incense, and that is a physical marker that helps me turn from one world in my home to another world. So I'm still at the same kitchen table, but I've marked a turn in a particular way. But if I was choosing, I would choose a home that had a door that I could close so that I could physically mark that time, that space, with a different kind of intention. So there's an invitation to reflect on how to live in your home in a way that honors what you hope for the rest of your body. And also an aspirational sort of thing. What would your home look like if you were choosing it? And he talks about cluttering and simplifying. He says many of the people that he works with choose to have their choice is that if they don't use something in a year, that they don't keep it, so that it doesn't clutter up your space with things that aren't actually life-giving and things that may be attuned to the life you thought you would lead that aren't really helpful for the life you do lead. When we bought our first house several years ago, I was teasing my husband. I said that he had a real self and ideal self. So what I realized is that when we bought our home, he was purchasing things for it that were for his ideal self. When he was a younger man, he camped a lot. And so we had a lot of camping gear, even though we never went camping. And so this sort of aspirational stuff was collecting, but it was never being used, and it wasn't useful for our real lives. So there's a space in our homes to consider how we support our real self and the self that we're called into being, and also to consider how we set aside those things that were maybe aspirational at one point in our lives, or that maybe are sentimental at some point in our lives, but are no longer things that are helpful for us to hold on to. We try not to clutter our space with the things that are representative of the people we used to be and won't be again, or people that we had hoped to be that actually are not, it's not consistent with who we're called to be. So home actually, I thought that was an interesting topic under body, but when I thought about it, I thought, oh, this is exactly because this is where we dwell. And so how does our home support our dwelling and into who we hope to become, and living into our desires to have people over, or to have solitude, to have space to study, or to have space for music? How does our home call us into the life that we're meant to lead? And finally, LaFond includes a section on intimacy and touch and sex. And he starts with a very helpful illustration. I actually have the same experience. I thought, oh, this is so helpful. He described how when his body is thirsty, sometimes he thinks he's hungry. But actually, if he drinks a glass of water, he's like, oh, I'm actually not hungry like I thought I was. He talked about how our cues can get distorted, and an invitation into thinking through how we can re-engage those cues. That sometimes we think that we need sex when what we need is intimacy. And he thought about what do healthy boundaries around intimacy look like? So he encourages people. It was actually, I wish that I could just share that whole section with you because it was so beautifully written. He talks about how we are made for connection, and that we are made for healthy connection that's consistent with both our morals and with our rule of life. So connection that is life-giving and joy-filled and not depleting. And he talked about how you might meet the need for intimacy in a way that surprises you by meeting the needs that you thought you had for sex. And so he talks about intimacy in friendship and intimacy with family, and also intimacy in sex, and engaging with intention in a way that honors who you are and honors the dignity of you and the partner that you're with, so that who you are and who God created you to be is honored in your expressions of intimacy. He talked about healthy boundaries, and that is something that's extremely serious and important for us to consider. Healthy boundaries are often distorted both by the society that we live in, and unfortunately many of us have had unhealthy sexual experiences. And so that distorted sense of what boundaries ought to be deserves attention and intention. What are healthy boundaries? And then reminding yourself of what those boundaries are. He's very clear that we have a particular biology that can give signals that are louder than our intentions. And so it's important to draw our attention back to our intentions regularly. And he does talk about the concern about using either casual sex or pornography as self-anesthetization, that sometimes our image of sexuality is so distorted that we fail to honor the dignity of ourselves or the dignity of those around us and how we encounter that. And of course, encourages, and I encourage you, if that's the place that you find yourself in, to find a healthy way of turning your attention back to who God has created you to be, and to honor your dignity and the dignity of those around you. And often healing can take place best with a skilled therapist, but these ideas, the idea of boundaries, really comes down to knowing yourself and honoring the dignity of yourself, that you're worth taking care of, that you are worth the effort of moderation and exercise, that you are worth the effort of reminding yourself those things that you ought to enjoy in moderation, or that at 10 o'clock you have to go to bed or have to start getting ready for bed, or whatever it is that you need to help yourself actually feel better, that you're worth it. And so being gentle and kind and also real about what you need to be well is the goal around the section on body. And I really appreciated, most of all, that LaFont emphasizes that none of the things that we do ought to be about punishing ourselves or chastising ourselves. That if you find yourself in a position, for example, of chronic illness, that punishing yourself for feeling weak or tired is not only unhelpful, but it fails to honor the dignity that you're imbued with, that your body was wonderfully and fearfully made. You are made by a loving God, and you are made in the image of God. And as we imagine together, or you imagine in your rule of life, what those boundaries are that will help you live in a healthy and good and life-giving and affirming and fulfilling way, that you will also be able to turn to your sisters and brothers and see in them people who are equally worth that dignity. They're equally imbued with the image of God and equally deserve that care and tenderness and honesty. So don't neglect those things that you ought to address and change. Don't be hard on yourself when you don't meet the hope that you have. And don't punish yourself for things that are not really punishable. If you're feeling tired, that is a signal from your body, and it's not something that's a failure in your body. If you're feeling weak, then pay attention to that signal, but don't punish yourself for that signal. And honoring one another, living as we're meant to be, created by a loving God, called to be children of the light. That means that we honor our bodies and honor one another. So I have been glad to be able to spend this time with you. I know that this is an ongoing effort for me, and I imagine it is an ongoing effort for many of us to both be grateful for the bodies we have, and also to be honest about those things that we wish to address to help us to live more fully into who we're called to be. That honesty can be difficult, but it's worthwhile. And remember, you are writing this rule only for yourself. So be honest and seek help if healing is something that you seek. Then seek somebody to help you get closer to that healing. And remember, you are deeply beloved. You are loved beyond all measure, wonderful just as you are, and called to live ever more faithfully into who God has created you to be. God bless you, friends. I look forward to seeing you again soon.